Welcome to Matt and the Macabre, a podcast about all things horror. Join us each week as we review another film, video game, story, or novel in the horror genre. Be warned, there will be major spoilers and harsh language. Listener discretion is advised.
What's up, guys? Hello, and welcome back to Matt and the Macabre. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm glad that you're here. I'm Matt. I'm your host. And real quick at the top, I just want to tell you, if you're enjoying the show, you can check out patreon.com/mattandthemacabre for exclusive content. We've got uncut episodes, working on some behind-the-scenes stuff, some video content coming down the pipeline. We're going to have a good time. So if you're enjoying the show, definitely go check that out. But today we are here to talk about Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D. This one came out August 13th, 1982, just a little over a year after Part 2, and it was the second and final Friday film directed by Steve Miner. This is the highest grossing sequel of the Friday the 13th franchise, at least until we get to Freddy vs. Jason, which, that thing is just in a whole other bracket. It doesn't even compare. This one, though, made $36 million, little over $36 million on a budget right around $2 million. And I see tons of people on websites and on forums saying that this is their favorite movie of the series. I'm going to go ahead and spoil my final thought just a little bit. I do not share their enthusiasm, but I think I've got some pretty good reasons. Originally, this was intended to be a completely different movie. The initial idea was to end the series as a trilogy. It was going to bring back Amy Steele as Jenny. Basically, she's gone back to college, she's learning how to defend herself, and at some point discovers the corpse of Paul in her dorm. So she decides to track Jason down and basically have like a final confrontation. I would love to see even just like a fully fleshed out concept of what that could have been. But Amy Steele turned it down and declined to return, so it was back to the drawing board. But where did the 3D come in? Why is this one in 3D? Well, 3D had been big in the early 50s, but had faded out pretty quickly, basically because of the cost and the headaches associated with it. The technology just really wasn't quite there yet. Of course, way back when, everything was done on film, and film is very delicate. As it gets used, it deteriorates. And when you're showing a 3D film, you have to run two projectors at once. So if even a single frame started to break down or it was altered in any way, if each and every frame were not exactly identical, then the film became virtually unwatchable. And that led to headaches, sometimes literal headaches, and all kinds of technical pains, and more importantly, money having to be spent. And so it just kind of fizzled out. Then, in 1981, a film called Coming At Ya, a spaghetti western of all things, was released in 3D and enjoyed a pretty good level of success. So basically, Paramount decided that they wanted to get in on the ground floor and be the first major film studio to release a 3D movie. This involves special lenses for their projectors that were made that they sent out to over 1,000 theaters to be a permanent fixture. They had to have 24/7 tech support in case there were any issues. This was a huge expense for Paramount, but the focus wasn't Friday the 13th. The focus was the big picture of how many 3D movies they could release and how much money they could make off of them over time. And 3D did have a brief comeback in the 80s, and it was a thing specifically for the third part in a franchise to be in 3D. We got Jaws 3D, Amityville 3D, of course Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D, but there were a whole lot more. Eventually, though, as it always does, it came down to money. Somebody filed a patent lawsuit, which is why 3D ended up dying once again, and wouldn't really make any kind of resurgence until Avatar in 2009, but that's definitely not what we're here to talk about. What we are going to talk about is that Friday the 13th 3D is a prime example of just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. The filmmakers really shot themselves in the foot because they were so worried during the shoot about the 3D technology that everything else just kind of fell to the wayside. Several of the actors and crew have been quoted as saying that's where all the focus was. They didn't care how the lines were said or how the actors acted. All they cared about was the 3D effects, and God knows they put enough of them in here. So let's go ahead and get into the movie. Just like last time, we get a 5-minute prologue showing us the ending of part 2. But this time, we get a little extra scene. We see Jason on the floor of the cabin, pull the machete out of his shoulder after Paul and Jenny leave and crawl away, which pretty much confirms the ending of part 2 being a dream. And as the camera focuses on the rotting head of Mrs. Voorhees, the title comes screaming toward the screen, out of the screen if you're watching in 3D, and the credits roll. And right away, this movie feels off. Even though the opening music played for parts 1 and 2 was ripped straight out of Psycho, it still did a good job of setting a mood. It felt like tense, foreboding. It felt like horror music. But here, this is some kind of weird, upbeat disco funk number that just feels completely out of place in a slasher movie. I guess the trills in it have maybe a really light, spooky touch, but it's not nearly enough. And it's not like they have a new guy doing the music. This is still Harry Manfredini, so I really don't know why the decision was made to go in that direction. But once the credits are done, we fade to black and open on some kind of little roadside convenience store. And now that I say that out loud, I don't think we will ever see another one of those whiteout transitions in the series. I'm pretty sure we're done with them. But there's a storm rolling in, and rows of laundry float gracefully in the breeze. And no, I'm not kidding. The first true 3D effect of this film is laundry blowing in the wind and out of the screen, for God's sake. Go ahead and buckle up because they're going to do this kind of shit a lot. A big, kind of dumpy looking guy walks through and knocks the pole out from one of the lines. This is Harold, who immediately starts getting his ass chewed by his wife Edna. I actually know this guy better as Barney, one of Al's no-man pals. Try saying that 3 times fast. From Married with Children. Anyway, when Harold picks up the pole to put it back, he makes damn sure to point it directly at the camera so it's hanging out of the screen. And I'm only pointing this out because they do. They call so much attention to it. We are watching a 3D horror movie, and right off the bat, they hit us with some fucking laundry and a wooden pole coming out of the screen. I swear to God, with only 5 exceptions, yes, I counted them, I don't understand a single decision that they made with the 3D. Edna bitches at Harold a little more and then closes the window and sits back on the couch. Oh, yeah, I didn't mention that part. The whole time she was bitching at Harold, she had her head hanging out the window like an episode of Cops in the 90s or something. But she goes back to crocheting while she's listening to a news report about the bodies being discovered from part 2. Which brings up the first big continuity issue with this franchise. Actually, it really comes up in the next movie, Part 4, but the foundation for it is laid right here. We know Friday the 13th Part 2 takes place 5 years after the original, and it happens on a Friday the 13th. Part 3 is picking up immediately after 2, so we start on Friday the 13th, but then we're going to bleed over into Saturday the 14th. Again, this is going to matter when we get to Part 4, but for now, just keep that in the back of your mind. Edna hears a noise outside and looks out the window to see somebody walking among the laundry, but of course their face is obscured, but we know that it's Jason. And they do that little trick where she turns her head for just a second to turn the TV off, but when she turns back, he's gone. She walks out, starts collecting the laundry, and we see Jason in the foreground just kind of watching her while she bitches some more about Harold not doing anything before she storms back into the house, and we see Jason just stalking her the whole time. We go over to Harold inside the store, talking to his goldfish and feeding them, and I don't get this. He starts pouring the fish food into his hand and licking it, like trying to show the goldfish that it's good so they'll eat it, until he starts reading the ingredients and finds out there are dayfly eggs in it and freaks the fuck out. I got nothing. I don't get this. But then he sees something on the shelf, and he runs over to pick up a bunny by the scruff of the neck and say that Edna's going to make a fur coat out of it if she sees it in the store. They are not setting Edna up to be a good person at all. Harold walks down the aisle, sampling his own goods, eating some of the peanuts, drinking some orange juice. Then he puts the lid back on everything and puts it back. When I was a kid, I always thought he was doing a shitty thing because I figured he was putting it back so he could sell it. But now I'm pretty sure he's putting it back to keep it hidden from Edna, because she's going to bust in pretty quick and crawl all over his ass again, this time about the doctor telling him to lose weight. Every single time this woman opens her mouth, she is bitching about something. She walks away, and Harold takes one last bite of a chocolate donut as kind of a weak kiss my ass before walking the bunny back over to the hutch, which he is horrified to find out has been broken into and his other bunnies have been killed. And in the first 3D horror shot of the film, and I use the word horror very lightly, a rattlesnake pops up in the cage and lunges at Harold and at the screen. He screams and hauls ass over to the house and makes a beeline straight for the shitter. And they actually do drop a fun line here, because when he brushes past Edna, she makes a comment that she can't find one of her crochet needles. Then, for reasons I will never understand, we cut to Harold in the shitter, and you can actually hear it. Kudos to the Foley artists on this movie, because it is straight up disgusting. You can tell by the noises it's making that it's like that fluffy mush shit hitting the water. I mean, Jesus Christ. Anyway, he digs some liquor out of a crate behind the toilet before he sees the curtain in the bathroom move. So without even thinking about wiping his ass after that gnarly shit we just listened to him take, he stands up, pulls up his britches, and kind of waddles over to the curtain. Of course, when he rips it open, there's nothing there. Ditto when he tries to close it. But when he opens up the back door to take a peek, Jason's there and plants a cleaver in the middle of his chest, and Harold will be the first, but not the last, not only in this movie, but in the franchise, to die with mud butt. We cut back to Edna, who hears the noise in the bathroom and goes looking for Harold. They play it slow and steady, and the music under it all is pretty good, but there's just no suspense. And I think that's because in the short time we've known her, Edna has been such a raging, unrelenting bitch that we're just ready for her to get it. And after a cheap jump scare with a rat, she does. Jason's hand comes through a window behind her to clamp over her mouth, and he shoves that missing crochet needle into the back of her skull and out of her mouth. Then we fade into another questionable scene where some kids are playing baseball in the street, and the kid holding the bat has it pointed directly at the camera so it's hanging out of the screen. Again, it's a horror movie. What are they doing with the 3D? But anyway, the kids scurry out of the street while a blue Dodge van drives by, and this is where we meet most of our core characters. Chris, our final girl for this movie, is behind the wheel. Generic horny teenagers Andy and Debbie are riding next to her. Well, generic's not really fair because there is something special about Debbie, but I'll get to that in a minute. Chris stops the van and hops out, heading up toward a house, and on her way she yells to somebody named Shelley in the back of the van to come out and meet his date, so they're there to pick up a girl. Andy and Debbie join her on the way to the door. They start kissing, and Chris makes a comment that they're getting boring because it's all about sex with them. And Andy drops a line here that I'm going to bring back up later. He says, "What would a weekend in the country be without sex?" And Debbie immediately jumps him and tells him to cool it, and he backs up real quick on that comment. I didn't mean it that way. So this is our first little hint at what I would call the big controversy of this movie. While they're walking and talking, we see in the background somebody in a real weird-looking mask walking slowly up behind him and holding a knife in his hand. The creepy music starts to play, and for the first time they do the ch-ch-ch with something completely unrelated to the killer. They broke their own rules here, because, of course, this is not the killer. He does stab Andy in the back, but the knife is made of rubber. Andy still jumps out of his skin and starts bitching at Shelley, who is the guy in the mask. But it's important to know that he's not an asshole. He's an actor. Shelley is basically here to be the dumpy comic relief, but without most of the comedy. He's Andy's roommate, and they never really explain how Andy pulled this together, but he got Shelley a date for the weekend. Her name is Vera. She's a Hispanic girl who has a very loud screaming match in Spanish with her mother after her mom tells Chris that she can't go with him and just slams the door in her face. But Vera walks out like nothing happened and gets introduced to Shelley as her date. Right off the bat, she's not impressed, does nothing to attempt to hide her disappointment, but nobody can really blame her, I guess. But thankfully, we only get a second of this because Debbie realizes the van's on fire. We cut over, and sure enough, there's a shit ton of smoke just pouring out of the windows of the van. They get inside to look around, and we find out that Chuck and Chili are hanging out in the back of the van, ripping the hell out of a couple of bongs. These might be the two most useless characters in the franchise. For starters, they've got to be pushing twice as old as Chris and the rest of them. Okay, maybe not that much, but they do look like they're easily in their 30s. They're damn sure not teenagers. And they are here to smoke copious amounts of weed, sleep, and that's about it. I really don't know what they're doing here. They are so unbelievably out of place. And I've never noticed it before, but for some reason watching it this time, it jumped out at me that Chuck is dressed up like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. He's got the green shirt, the dark pink, like almost maroon colored pants. And I don't think it's any secret at this point that Shaggy and Scooby, Shaggy at least for sure, are stoners. Honest to God, with all the other batshit ideas floating around in this movie, it would not surprise me at all to find out they did that on purpose. But let's move on. They're driving down the road, and in the midst of Shelley's bitching at Chuck and Chili about all the weed that they smoke, they're going to drop a bit of a bombshell on us. Andy asks Chris how much further to the lake, and Chris says, well, we would have been there already if some people didn't have to go to the bathroom every 5 minutes. And Debbie is going to pipe up and say, well, that's what happens when you're pregnant. I'm just going to go ahead and say, I hate this. They are going to hit this real hard right here in this scene, especially in a minute when the cop comes up behind them with the lights and siren blaring, so everybody starts eating the weed to get rid of it. She's going to turn it down, yelling, no way, we're pregnant, remember? But then they are never going to touch it again. We're going to see her in the shower later. She's not showing. She doesn't look pregnant. She's going to drink beer, or at least ask for one. I don't know if they were going for a darker tone and trying to set up Jason to kill a pregnant girl, or if that is supposed to be like a bait and switch so that we'll think Debbie's the final girl, because of course they wouldn't kill somebody who's pregnant, so when she does die, we'll be shocked by it. Like in Psycho, when Janet Leigh was billed as the star of the movie and then got killed 15 minutes in. Either way, it was the wrong decision. I do think there may be a way that you can play with that and make it tense, make it suspenseful, make it actually mean something. But Friday the 13th Part 3 is for damn sure not that movie, not by a long shot. But back to the van, everybody's passing weed back and forth, and when Andy reaches back to ask for a hit, the camera cuts to Chili handing the joint directly to the camera, so in 3D it looks like she's handing it to you. As I already mentioned, a cop car comes up behind them with lights and siren going, and everybody starts to freak out and start eating the weed to try to get rid of it. Shelley completely pusses out and just won't touch any, which just gives Vera one more thing not to like about him. But it turns out not to matter because when Chris pulls the van over, the cop just keeps right on going. We find out he's going to the convenience store where Harold and Edna were killed, and as they drive by, Chris watches the paramedics load the bodies into the back of an ambulance. Debbie leans over and tells her not to let her imagination run away with her, which is now the second hint that we've gotten so far that there's something bad in Chris's past. Next, we get what is the first real instance of this movie trying to recapture what made the original special. Chris has to slam on the brakes because there's an old man asleep in the middle of the road. Everybody piles out to check on him, help him up. This old dude's name is Abel. Immediately, he puts something out in front of all their faces and says, I found this today. There were other parts of the body. Proud of myself. That's actually not a bad impression. But anyway, Shelley realizes it's an eyeball, and everybody loses their shit, hauls ass back to the van, and Abel just keeps on rambling. He said he wanted me to have this. He wanted me to warn you. And this whole thing just makes no sense. We're meant to think that Jason wanted Abel to have the eyeball and wanted him to warn everybody. But for one, Jason doesn't talk. Number two, Crazy Ralph warned everybody to stay away, and Jason had no trouble strangling his ass to death with some barbed wire, so why is Abel still breathing? I get he's basically here to fill the Crazy Ralph role, but Where it felt earned and genuine for Ralph, here it just feels forced and stupid. Abel is not fit to carry Ralph's jockey strap. Abel is here because Ralph was in the original, and that's as far as it goes. After this, we finally get to Higgins Haven, a property owned by Chris's dad and the setting for the rest of the movie. So just to be clear, so far on Crystal Lake, we have 2 completely separate summer camps and 1 summer home. And as we move on, that list is just going to get bigger. I do want to give the filmmakers credit for one nice bit of foreshadowing here, though. When the van is pulling in, we see it right over a wooden bridge, and we see that all the planks that make up this bridge are real raggedy, and they're like rattling in their spot. The bridge is not real steady. But instead of just being a generic throwaway shot of a vehicle, this will actually come back into play later. However, it's also a little too obvious, because the very first time I showed this one to my kids, my son immediately piped up and said, "I'll bet that bridge falls apart later." So I guess in this case they did their job a little too well. But they're going to cheat again with a shot from the inside as we watch the van pull in through the window, and we see someone in a flannel shirt standing there, and they'll play the ch-ch-ch again. I guess because the last thing we saw Jason wearing was flannel, we're supposed to assume it's him. But this pisses me off because remember in parts 1 and 2, they only used that sound effect, that cue, when we were in the POV of the killer. But now they have shot that all to hell, and they're just going to use it whenever they damn well please, and it loses something there. But anyway, Chris goes to take her bags in the house, but she goes in real slow and cautious because the door is already unlocked. When she steps in, somebody grabs her by the shoulder and kind of yanks her over to the side, but then starts kissing her. This is Rick, and he and Chris have this weird, like, on-again, off-again relationship that he wants to commit to, but she's not ready. At least that's what I'm getting off of it. These two have this awkward, like Steve and Alice level of chemistry that's not really chemistry every time they're on screen together. Rick is going to spend the movie trying to get into Chris's pants while she tries to get him to just slow down a little. But then, not much happens for a little while. Chris gives Debbie her old bedroom for the weekend. It's got a hammock instead of a bed, which sounded awesome when I was a kid, but now that I'm an adult, I just think of how destroyed my back would be the next morning after trying to sleep in that damn thing. While this is going on, Chris sees the barn door open outside, which doesn't matter because then we're going to cut directly to the barn where Chris is helping Rick pull some hay up into the loft with a pulley system that they're going to set up real heavy for a payoff at the end. And this is Rick's second attempt at getting laid, and it's going to be interrupted by somebody screaming back at the house. Everybody runs in to see what's going on, and Chris is going to find Shelley in an armoire. That's right, I know fancy words. With a hatchet in his head and blood running down his face. When Andy gets into the room, though, he gets down next to Shelley and starts to tickle him, who starts giggling like a little bitch, because it's just another prank. Chris kind of snaps on him and hits him a few times before she storms out of the room. Shelley basically has just totally shit the bed on the atmosphere in the house. Vera asks Rick if she can borrow his car to go to the store, and as she's leaving, Shelley runs up to her and begs her to take him with her. She starts to pull away anyway, but then I guess his puppy dog eyes win her over, so she stops, and Shelley does the weirdest, like, arms outstretched bubble butt run that I've ever seen up to the VW Bug. And it occurs to me, somebody behind the scenes must, like, have a thing for bugs. Jenny drove one, Rick drives one, and I know there's one in part 6. I'm going to try and really pay attention and see if there are any more as we go. But back to the movie. We go to Chris and Debbie, where they're going to tease just a little more of Chris's backstory, with Debbie telling Chris this is just Shelley's way of getting attention. He doesn't know about what happened to her. It's only like a 20-second scene, but I'm bringing it up because Chris's backstory is a big deal in this movie that I think needs to be addressed, so I'm trying to keep track of all the times that they tease it or allude to it. We catch up with Shelley and Vera at a gas station. For some reason, the movie's opening theme music is playing over the speakers in the store. The cashier gets real pissy when Vera tries to use food stamps, So she tells Shelly, who is enjoying a good old-fashioned skin mag right in the middle of the store, that she needs some money. He tosses her his wallet. She misses, it hits the floor, and when she goes to grab it, a black-heeled boot steps on it. This is Fox. She is in a gang. Another word that I'm going to use very lightly, with two dudes named Ali and Loco. Just so we're clear, Loco is a white boy. Not real sure why I feel the need to clarify that, but I do. Ali and Loco snatch Shelly up while Fox basically just teases Vera with the wallet. She makes her ask really nice to give it back. Nobody gets hurt. Fox doesn't even take the money. These guys are they're not even high school, but more like middle school bullies, except they ride motorcycles. But when it's done, Vera storms out of the store with Shelly and tells him to drive because the way that I feel right now, I'd probably get us into an accident. That's actually damn near a spot-on impression. I ain't shitting you. But Ali comes out of the store and stares down Shelly, who gets so scared by this that he accidentally backs into their motorcycles and knocks them all over. Ali gets pissed and runs to the car, and he pulls up his chain like he's going to swing it. Shelly floors it toward Ali, but he slams on the brakes because he just can't do it. And Ali comes up to the window and smiles for a minute like everything's okay, and then just busts through the windshield in the driver window with the chain wrapped around his hand, where his arm just kind of stays there to make sure that's hanging out of the screen. Shelly finally grows some balls for the only time in this movie and turns the car around to run the bikes over one more time before he takes off down the road. Well, really, he just runs over the tire of Ali's bike, but I'm going to give it to him. It's a nice little moment for Shelly, and it's the only one that he's going to get. We go back to Andy, Debbie, Chuck, and Chili just hanging out, and the next wonderful 3D effect is going to be Andy's yo-yo coming down toward the screen over and over and over again. I don't fucking get it. Shelly and Vera make it back, and Rick is understandably pissed about his car windows, and all they can say is it's not their fault. We do get just a couple of brief shots of Jason opening the barn door to look out, but at this point we can't see his face, and we don't linger very long. They're just there to let us know he's in there. Rick and Chris climb into his car to just go hang out by themselves, and they're going to just straight up disappear for a little while. So while Debbie and Andy head off down to the lake by themselves and everyone else, I guess, heads into the house, the dreaded motorcycle gang is going to show up again and start siphoning gas out of the van. Now, I'm actually going to give a little nod to this scene as well because it's another one that's going to matter more than you think it will while it's happening. Like I said, they're here to siphon gas out of their van, but they're going to use it to burn down the barn. And the whole time Fox is saying, we shouldn't do this. And Ali has to reassure, nobody's going to get hurt, baby. Like, what kind of gang is this? Like, are we supposed to believe these are dangerous people? I'm going to leave it alone. I'm going to move on. Fox goes off to the barn to wander around and look at all the stuff in there. And the whole time Jason is just off to the side of the frame watching her. Ali and Loco finish getting the gas. And when Loco heads over to start pouring it in the barn, Fox is swinging back and forth on the rope at the hayloft. So this is the second time they've made sure that we know there's a rope there. But they play that trick again where Loco's bitching at her for screwing around, and then he looks away for a second. When he looks back, she's disappeared. So now he heads into the barn to look for her, and eventually he finds her stuck up on a rafter from a pitchfork in her neck, which is actually a pretty good visual. He turns around and Jason is right there with another pitchfork, stabbing it straight toward the screen. And finally, at the 42-minute mark, the 3D has been incorporated into a kill for the first time in this movie. Of course, in a minute, Ollie's going to head into the barn, calling out for Fox and Loco, not able to find either one of them until Loco's body falls on top of him from the loft. And then we see Jason jump down into a stall, and Ali grabs a machete and goes in after him, but when he swings the machete, Jason just kind of sidesteps it and smacks him in the head with like some kind of club or wrench. We don't see it real clear. And then he stands over Ali and just keeps beating him in the head with this thing before he finally walks away and turns to watch Andy and Debbie through the window. We catch up to Chris and Rick. I'm not dead sure where they are, but it's nighttime, and this is where Chris is finally getting ready to tell Rick and us what happened to her 2 years ago. But before that, we're going to go back to the house where Chuck and Chili are passed out on the couch, and Andy and Shelly are engaged in a juggling contest. Wouldn't you know it, we get an overhead shot of them juggling so the fucking fruit can fly out of the screen. I swear... Ugh. Oh, it irritates me. Debbie and Vera are sitting on another couch watching this, and they are just as bored as I am at this point. But Debbie puts a stop to it by taking Andy upstairs, which leaves Shelly and Vera alone in the room for some more awkward dialogue. Shelly's going to go ahead and shoot his shot, but he is going to fall flat on his poor pudgy ass. But Vera didn't have to be quite so bitchy when she shut him down. Like, she didn't have to put her hand on his mouth and shut him up. But she tells Shelly she's going to go outside for a little while, and when she gets back, they'll talk. We cut to Debbie and Andy trying to figure out the mechanics of having sex in a hammock, which they apparently do, but I'll be damned if I got a clue on how to make it happen. But very quickly, we're back to Chris and Rick, and Chris is finally going to fill us in on this incident that they've dropped hints about that has her so wary about coming back here. What she's going to tell us is that 2 years ago, Rick dropped her off late after a date, and this caused a fight with her parents where her mother slapped her for the first time in her life. So she decided to punish them by running off and hiding out in the woods until morning to make them sorry for what they did. She fell asleep under a tree and woke up to some twigs snapping, and this horribly deformed man with a knife, which we know to be Jason, came after her, and she ran and tried to fight him off, knocked the knife away, but she ended up blacking out and waking up in her own bed, and then her parents would never talk about what happened and act like it never did. Now, while she's talking, we do get to see this scene and kind of like a faded overlay, and it does cause a few problems, continuity problems. For starters, this is 2 years ago, but Jason is wearing the same clothes that he took from Harold at the beginning of the movie. The other issue is he looks like he does in this movie, and not in part 2 where he had the long, lanky mountain man hair. I've seen people say that he didn't actually have long hair in part 2 because the ending was a dream sequence, so it was just Jenny imagining what she thought Jason might look like. The problem with that is Paul and Jenny both see what Jason looks like before they leave the cabin because Jenny pulls the sack off Jason's head. So even though the ending of part 2 was a dream, Jason didn't actually bust through that window. That's actually what Jason looked like. But let's get to the big question of the scenario. What exactly did Jason do to Chris? I am going to posit, and I am not the only one, that Chris was raped. For one, it's a fact that when a person faces extreme trauma like an assault of that kind, that their brain will just kind of shut down. Not really shut down, but shut out what happened as like a defense mechanism. Number 2, Chris says that Jason was dragging her along the ground. Jason does not take his victims somewhere else to kill them. If Jason gets his hands on you, he is trying to kill you right there. Number 3, the fact her parents would never talk about what happened that night, or how they found her, or how she got back to her bed. Number 4, the comment Andy made toward the beginning about a weekend in the country without sex, and then Debbie jumping his shit like it was a super offensive thing to say, or maybe she may be sensitive to him saying something like that. That would explain Chris's blackout. It explains her parents acting like it never happened. It explains the reaction to Andy's comment. And it also explains why Chris keeps Rick at a distance the way she does, not really willing to be fully, physically intimate with him. And it also fits if you believe that the filmmakers were going for something darker this time around. They've already got Jason set up to kill a pregnant woman. But they're going to pull us out of this moment kind of gently with the lights on Rick's car dying out. And when he tries to start the car, it's dead. So they have to walk back to the house. We catch up with Chuck back at the house, who goes outside for a late night boo-boo. I do like the roll of Johnny Asswipe hanging off a deer antler in the outhouse. He's going to drop trow and go about his business, and of course he's going to light up a doobie. But when he hits it, the outhouse shakes. At first he thinks it's just the weed, but then it happens again, so he kind of panics and pulls his pants up again without wiping his ass. He looks around, and he does spot Jason heading off into the barn, But when he turns to walk off, he runs into Chili and finishes shitting himself. He's going to tell Chili that Shelly is fucking with him and that he just ducked off into the barn. She drags Chuck in there to look for him, and the whole time Chuck's being a bit of a bitch about it and just begging to go back to the house. Chili even grabs an axe at one point to scare Shelly with and to let us know that there's an axe in the barn, but they never find anything, so they just make their way back to the house. And at this point, I realize Chuck never wiped his ass, so he will be the second dude to die in this movie with mud butt. I mean, yeah, he wasn't in the outhouse very long, but at the very least, his cinnamon ring is crusty when Jason throws him into that panel. Kind of wonder if it scorched his dingleberries, but I digress. We cut back over to Vera sitting on a little pier with her feet hanging over the water. Someone's hand reaches up from the water and grabs her. She screams and gets up and scrambles back, and Shelly jumps out of the water in a wetsuit and a hockey mask holding a spear gun. This, of course, is where Jason will get the now iconic hockey mask. It is such an important part of this franchise. It really cannot be understated. But they came across it kind of by accident. One of the guys behind the scenes was a hockey fan and just thought it might look cool. When they tried it on Richard Brooker, the guy who plays Jason in this one, it didn't quite fit right, so they made a bigger mold, and that's where it came from. There's no great story. There was no grand plan. It was just something somebody thought would be cool, and it became a part of movie history. But Vera's going to push Shelly and jump his ass and yell at him, why do you do these stupid things? And he's going to confess that it's basically like Debbie said. It's his way of getting attention, and he just wanted Vera to like him. She says, I do like you, but not when you act like a jerk, which is complete horseshit, because the only time she's acted like she was even okay being in the same room with Shelly was when he finally sacked up and ran over Ali's tire. Shelly's going to go off and pout a little bit until he hears a noise at the barn and walks over to check it out, thinking maybe it's Chuck and Chili doing something he shouldn't see. And it's at this point I realize they should have called this movie Stay Out of the Barn. But meanwhile, Vera is sitting back at that little pier looking at pictures in Shelly's wallet before dropping it into the water. She walks down the bank and gets into the water to try to get the wallet, and at this point, Jason comes strutting down the pier, holding that spear gun in all of his hockey mask glory. I have knocked this movie a lot so far, and I think it deserves it. But this is absolutely a cool moment for Jason that I'm not going to try and take away from. But they are going to go and kind of ruin it. For a full 19 seconds. Yes, I checked the time. Vera thinks she's talking to Shelly. Hey, I dropped your wallet. I'm sorry. Look, I got it. Meanwhile, Jason starts pointing the spear gun at her, and you can actually see him hook it onto the cable that the bolt is going to fly down in a minute. And the whole time she keeps on with, what are you doing? You cut that out. It's so stupid. I get that she just saw Shelly wearing that mask a few minutes ago. But Shelly is a pudgy dude with long curly hair, and this dude is built like a brick shithouse. Shelly's like 5'8", 5'9". Richard Brooker is a full half a foot taller than Shelly. There is no way in hell you could mistake one of them for the other one. I guess this is just one of those moments that you either go with it or you don't, and I just can't. And I think that's because up until this point, I'm just not having as much fun as I did in the first two movies. Now, I do want to say this is a pretty good effect, and the 3D works pretty well when the bolt comes flying toward the screen, and then we cut to see it hit Vera right in the eye, and she just kind of falls over into the water. And Jason is going to kind of saunter off with a little swagger in his step and just eyeball the house for a minute. Now that he's got his face covered up, he's free to go where he wants. We cut back to Andy and Debbie, who apparently figured out how to make the hammock work. She goes off to take a shower, and we see Jason has snuck into the house. There's some back and forth shots from Debbie in the shower to Jason coming up the stairs, and then there's just a brief little moment when they try to make us think that Jason is coming toward Debbie in the shower. But then immediately we very clearly see Andy's feet coming toward the curtain because he's walking on his hands again. But they wait until his feet actually touch the curtain to play that sharp musical sting that's supposed to make you jump, but at this point we've already seen it coming. We know it's Andy, and it just doesn't work. I also have to wonder why she tells Andy she'll have a beer after freaking the fuck out at the start of the movie over the weed. At this point, I don't know if they're backpedaling on the pregnancy thing or if they just forgot. But either way, Andy leaves the bathroom walking on his hands again, and he goes off to a room on the side, which is actually kind of fun because when he does that, we cut back to Debbie in the shower for a second and cut back to the hallway, and we see that Jason is also in the hallway now, standing up against the wall with a machete. And when Andy walks by Jason, he's going to step up and slash down on him with the machete and just split his pelvis in half. Debbie gets out of the shower and starts calling for Andy. Of course, he can't answer. He's in pieces. So she goes back to the room and climbs into the hammock with a copy of Fangoria, which is a fun little plug. And this is the second time they will try to recapture some of that magic from the original. She's laying in the hammock, and blood is going to start dripping on her from above. She looks up to see Andy's body on a beam, cut in half and folded up with his collarbone jammed in his asshole, and then a hand is going to reach up and clap on her forehead while a knife gets shoved through her chest. I really don't want to hate on it because overall it's a pretty good kill, it really is, but it's just not on par with the arrow through the throat from the first movie. And every time they try to recreate that imagery from the original, it just falls flat. Sometimes a lot, sometimes just a little, but it never quite cuts it. But we're going to get a quick flash of Chris and Rick still on their way back to the house before we get to Chuck making popcorn on the stove and see yet another place where they spent their 3D budget. We've got a film about a bloodthirsty killer, but instead, we're going to focus on popcorn jumping out of the fucking screen. But anyway, Chili comes in, they kind of playfully bicker a little bit, and then the lights go out. Chili sends Chuck out to the breaker box to check it out. We already know Chuck is a chicken shit, so this scene is a little fun, but he's going to step barefoot into some water, which is actually going to be important in a minute. While this is going on, we cut back up to Chili, who hears a noise at the door, and she opens it up to find Shelly stumbling in with his throat slit. Of course, she doesn't believe it and just goes about her business as he slumps down and dies. Back at the breaker box, Chuck gets the lights back on and we see Jason's already standing behind him. Again, I'm being hard on this movie. I think I'm right to, but I do want to give compliments where I can. And when the light bulb behind Chuck just kind of flares to life and Jason just appears underneath it, it's a pretty sweet visual. It's pretty well done. And now Chuck is going to get thrown into the electrical box, and because he's standing barefoot in water, he's going to be electrocuted, which sends us back up to Chili, who's wondering why the lights are coming and going. And when she pushes on Shelly to get him up, and he falls over like 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag, she realizes this time it's for real and starts to freak the fuck out. She starts screaming and running through the house, hollering for Andy and Debbie. She runs upstairs to get him, and we see Jason grab the poker out of the fire before we hear Chili scream from upstairs because she found their bodies too. And when she comes back down, Jason is there to shove the poker into her guts. And this one doesn't even count for a 3D effect because even though we see the poker before it goes into her stomach, it's over in a flash. It doesn't have time to focus and come through the screen. It's just a wasted opportunity. But Jason's going to pick her up and cradle her in his arms and walk out of the frame. We catch up to Chris and Rick as they finally get back to the house. Of course, they immediately realize something is off and start looking around. Rick makes the brilliant decision to go outside on his own to look around. Chris tells him to wait, but he doesn't, and when she goes outside calling for him, we see that Jason's got him just off to the side of the house with his hand clamped over his mouth so he can't call out. And then, in what I consider the only truly so bad it's good moment in this movie, Jason is going, follow me here. Jason is going to pick up this grown man by his head like a foot off the ground, and then still have the strength to squeeze his skull so hard that his eyeball pops out of the socket and comes screaming toward the screen. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. The rubber head is clearly a rubber head, and the metal wire hangs a foot out of the skull directly in the camera frame. But it really is a lot of fun. I'm going to let them off easy on this one. Then we cut back to Chris in the house. There's water running everywhere because the shower's still going, and there are bloody clothes in it. She runs around calling for Rick, checks around outside, And while she's out there, all of a sudden, Loco's body falls out of a tree near the barn wrapped up in a rope. She screams and runs back into the house, still calling out for Rick. She starts going around locking all the doors and windows. And then there's this little sequence where a window keeps opening and closing, banging against the house. And she runs over to close and lock it. There is a huge window to her left. And the way it's framed, you just know something's going to come through that window. But then it doesn't. And then it doesn't. And then it still doesn't. This drags on for 24 seconds before Rick's body finally comes crashing through the window. And at that point, I just don't care anymore. You have missed your opportunity. Time and time again, they're going to try to go for suspense, but their timing is so fucked up and cattywampus that they just can't nail it. But then Jason climbs in the window carrying an axe, and as much shit as I've given this movie, this entire final chase is pretty good. Chris drops a bookshelf on him. She tries to misdirect him by loudly opening and closing one door just to very quietly sneak into another. But she's going to fuck herself because she'll stumble across Debbie's body in this closet and scream, which is going to give her away. Jason starts hacking through the door with the axe, and while he's doing that, Chris very smartly just kind of sacks up and takes the knife out of Debbie's back. So when Jason reaches his hand in to open the door, she stabs him in it and then busts out of this closet just swinging the knife at him like a mad woman. She's going to back Jason down this hallway and actually get him down by stabbing him in the leg where he groans and just makes all kinds of racket, which feels weirdly out of place watching it now because, Jason's always the silent killer. But again, I'm one of the ones I maintain he was human and very much alive up until part 6. So when I stop and make myself remember that, it lines up. But Chris runs off and tries to get through another door. Jason pulls the knife out of his leg and he throws it toward the screen where it sticks right into the door frame beside her head, where the string that it followed is clearly visible. And it kills me, man, because they spent no money and even less effort trying to cover up their tricks of the trade this time around. It's just awful. But Chris is going to get into this room and bust out a window to climb out of it. And just as she's about to get down, Jason reaches through the window and gets a hold of her jacket. They're going to struggle for a few seconds, and we're going to see her jacket slowly start to tear before it finally gives way and she falls to the ground. And then, in a move that I genuinely think is awesome, she's going to peek in through the window to watch him coming down and see what door he's going to come out of. Then she's going to wait by that door with a big-ass fire log and crack him in the head with it as he walks out the door. Now, the foreshadowing I talked about earlier is going to pay off. She's going to get the van started and take off, even trying to run Jason down, but he jumps out of the way. Then, just as she gets to that bridge, the van is going to die. And that's because, if you remember, Ali and his pair of misfits siphoned all the gas out of the van. She's actually going to realize it's out of gas and switch to the reserve tank, but just as the van tires back up, one of the planks is going to give way underneath it. Jason reaches in to the van and gets her by the neck, and I always laugh at this. She actually gets out of this here by just rolling up the window and trapping his hands. I don't even know if that's actually possible. But she climbs out of the van, and Jason busts the window with his mask to get out. Now Chris is going to run into the barn and hide. Jason spends a little time looking for her, and we see he's getting pissed that he can't find her, but that's because she's up above him hanging on to a rafter. Everything is fine until she starts to lose her grip, and then she ends up on the underside of the beam. And she just can't hold on anymore, and she falls down directly on top of him. She's going to scramble up into the hayloft and cover the opening with a bale of hay before ducking down and hiding again. But real quick, she'll get up behind Jason and crack him in the back of the head with a shovel. He just kind of crumbles to the ground, and now the rope finally pays off as she wraps it around his neck before rolling him out of the hayloft to hang him. She's going to kind of take her time getting down and struggles a little bit to get the door open because Jason had it barricaded. But she swings the door open, and we see Jason hanging just limp from the rope. But only for a second, because he's going to grab a hold of the rope and lift himself up. And then, for reasons that I can't explain other than the script said so, Jason pulls up his mask to show his real face and give her a big shit-eating grin before pulling the mask back down and coming after her again. But, surprise, surprise, Ali is going to come busting out of one of the stalls and try to attack Jason. If you were watching this for the first time, you might actually think that Chris would be saved. But Ali goes out like a bitch immediately when Jason spins around and cuts his hand off, then just hacks him to shit with the machete. But while he's doing that, Chris is going to grab the axe that Chili showed us earlier, and when Jason stands back up, she's going to plant it right in his forehead. And he's going to kind of hold his arms out and stumble toward her like the Frankenstein monster for a second, in a pretty decent 3D effect where it kind of looks like he's reaching for us before he finally falls to the ground. At this point, Chris is going to get in a boat and go out on the lake in another callback to the original. It didn't make sense when Alice did it. It doesn't make much sense now that Chris is doing it. Although I have seen some people say that she just doesn't believe Jason is dead and heads out onto the lake as like a precaution so she can watch for him and get away, but she just ends up passing out. I mean, I guess I'll buy that at this point. Honestly, I'm having a hard time giving a shit. But either way, we get to the next morning and she wakes up screaming in the boat, and after a couple of cheap jump scares that really don't work, she's going to see Jason without his mask in the upstairs window of the house. And now that I say that out loud, it occurs to me that that doesn't make any fucking sense, because she left Jason with the axe in his head on the floor of the barn. Why the hell would he be upstairs in the house? Either way, at this point, I just have to say that this is, without a doubt, the worst looking Jason without his mask we've ever had. Now, I know that it hadn't come out at this point, but because I grew up in the 80s, the only thing I can think of when I see Part 3 Jason without his mask is Sloth from the Goonies, and I just cannot take him seriously anymore. Jason's going to bust out of the house and just kind of eyeball Chris real menacingly and start running toward the lake as she frantically tries to get the boat off a log in the water, but when she looks back, Jason's gone, and the door of the house is in perfect condition. She was just seeing things. But I still say, why the hell does she see him in the house? But as Chris is frantically looking around trying to spot Jason, suddenly Mrs. Voorhees pops up out of the water behind Chris to drag her down. And I have so many problems with this moment. As I've mentioned previously, and hundreds if not thousands of people before me have said, that shot of Jason jumping out of the lake to pull Alice in will forever be the legacy of that first Friday the 13th movie. Here, they tried to recapture that once again, but they fail so fucking hard that I can't even really put it into words. No, that's not true. I can. The drop in quality is on par with Jabba the Hutt. Just follow me here, okay? I want you to think back to Return of the Jedi, the original version, when we were first introduced to Jabba the Hutt. And even though it was a puppet, it looked awesome. Now I want you to fast forward to the special editions of the original trilogy. Everybody's number 2 complaint behind Greedo shooting first was that the CGI Jabba the Hutt looked like absolute dog shit. That is the drop in quality that we are talking about here. Now, granted, when Jason came up in the original, the makeup wasn't great, but it happened so fast, we weren't given time to linger on it, and so that doesn't really register. But here, Mrs. Voorhees' rotting corpse, complete with the sweater, pops up behind Chris and just kind of stays there for like 2 full seconds before whoever it is in the makeup wraps their arms around Chris and cops a feel on their way down to the water. It looks like absolute horse shit. In fact, I think that's probably why they put her in the sweater, because if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have a fucking clue who the hell that's supposed to be. The effects are awful. The way it just kind of lingers makes it even worse, and it comes absolutely out of left field. In the original, we were told several times about Jason drowning in the lake. It was brought up and sprinkled throughout the movie so that when it happens at the end, at least you could see how they got there, like we've been prepped for it. But how they came to this decision, I can't fucking explain. It's an incredibly piss-poor sequence that never should have been here. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say it's the worst ending of the series. We'll get there when we get there, but I think it would be hard to pick between Part 3, Part 8, and Jason Goes to Part 3 and Part 8. But it's definitely in the running. They are trying, yet again, to retread the dream sequence jump scare that was executed so perfectly in the original. The one in Part 2 wasn't quite up to par, but it was leagues above what they do here. But to get back on track, we dissolve into a scene of the police coming in the house, and one of them brings Chris out and escorts her to a police car while she kind of darts her head around real skittish and goes from like screaming in terror to cackling laughter, which I'm pretty sure was supposed to remind us of Sally at the end of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but like pretty much all the other nods and callbacks they try, it just doesn't work. The police car drives away, and the camera pans back over to the barn, where we see Jason is in fact still lying on the floor of the barn with the axe in his head. Then we get another shot of the lake, and finally fade to the credits. And there you have Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D. I have been really hard on this movie during this review, and I think it deserves it. The only good thing to come out of this movie is the hockey mask for Jason, and of course you cannot overstate how important that would become. But is that enough to carry an entire film? Unfortunately, absolutely not. They were counting on the 3D gimmick to carry this movie, but that couldn't do it either. And the main reason that couldn't do it is because all the 3D was focused on shit that never should have been 3D. I mentioned at the start of the podcast there were 5 times that I understood what they were doing with the 3D. That is the pitchfork killing Loco, the spear gun at Vera, Rick's eye popping out at the camera, which I still have to admit is a shitload of fun, even though it does kind of look like shit, Jason throwing the knife at Chris, and Jason reaching for the audience when he's doing his Frankenstein monster walk. 95% of the 3D action in this horror movie is not action. It's laundry, for fuck's sake. It's yo-yos and oranges and popcorn. That is not what I want when I come to a 3D horror movie. Yes, we want things coming at us when we're watching in 3D, but those things need to be dangerous. And a yo-yo dropping in my face just doesn't cut it. The biggest problem is this issue is actually compounded when you're not watching in 3D. And keep in mind, you couldn't watch this movie in 3D at home until the 2000s. And in 2D, it's just weird. I've seen people say that this one feels different than the other ones. It just feels different. It feels different because there's no 3D effect to justify these weird-ass camera angles. They call themselves out even worse. Without the 3D, why is Harold pointing the pole at the camera? Why is a kid holding a ball bat into the camera? Why is Andy yo-yoing into the camera? Why are we getting an overhead shot of popcorn going everywhere? These angles and these scenes are hard to justify in 3D, but it's impossible to justify them without it, which is the way that most people will experience this movie. As my final thoughts, can I recommend this movie? I've already said several times that Friday the 13th is my favorite franchise, and it really is. It was my first one. I'm biased to it. I absolutely love this series. I want to love all of these movies. And as hard as I've been on it, there are some good things here. I've already mentioned Jason getting the hockey mask, but you just can't imagine what this series would be without it. Once we get away from that weird disco funk number during the opening credits, the music's pretty strong. The final chase with Chris is actually a lot of fun. There's like screenwriting 101, some of the things they set up for later. Even though they're goofy as hell, like the gas being siphoned from the van, they are fun little moments that pay off if you were paying attention. But at the end of the day, I've said before that my feelings about a movie largely come down to, did I have a good time watching it? And this time around, I just really don't have as much fun with this one. After the opening, it's 45 minutes before Jason kills anybody, and I feel every second of it because these characters, while I do think in general they are better than the cast of the original, they're still a step down from the cast in Part 2, And per the actors and the crew, that's another thing that can be blamed on the 3D because that's the only thing they were worrying about. They didn't care how the scenes were acted, how the lines were delivered. All they cared about was that the 3D worked, but it just doesn't. So as much as it pains me to say it, and believe it or not, it really does, I cannot give this movie a recommend. Part 2 took the basic skeleton of the original movie and then added to it. It played some of the same beats, but it didn't feel like a slave to what had gone before it. I think Part 3 could have been a hell of a lot better if they had done the same thing. And instead, they embraced a gimmick and then kept trying to call back to the first movie, only they don't do it as well, so it's not enjoyable. Yeah, Abel, the old dude with the eyeball, is creepy, but he just doesn't have the same charm that Ralph did. He doesn't carry the same weight. Gender swapping Jack's death and exchanging the arrow for the throat for a knife through the chest just doesn't work as well. And Mrs. Voorhees jumping out of the lake is executed so poorly, it's fucking infuriating. You can spend 10 minutes on YouTube and see the very best parts of this movie. I recommend that you do that. Do not sit there and give away an hour and a half of your life. In a weird way, I kind of wish it was worse. I would love to say it was so bad that it's good. I can enjoy stuff like that. But this is not. This is just bad. But as many issues as this movie had, it did make a lot of money. Again, it's the highest grossing sequel in the franchise until we got to Freddy vs. Jason, which is, again, that's a completely different ballgame. You cannot make a comparison. And I understand from Paramount's point of view that if you're a business and you know you can guarantee adding $18 to $25 million to your bottom line by spending $2 million, why wouldn't you do that? And so another sequel was made. But this one would take a little more time. We got the first 3 Friday the 13th movies within 3 years, but it would be 2 more years before we would see Jason in theaters again. But before we get there, we have not 1, but 2 novelizations to talk about. And right off the bat, I've got to tell you that I'm very upset neither one of these were pop-up books. Oh, that's awesome. I'm too proud of that. I can feel people unsubbing right now, but that's okay. The first one was written by Michael Avallone and was published in 1982 to coincide with the film's release. Now, Michael Avallone was a pretty prolific writer of movie and TV tie-ins, multimedia tie-ins. In addition to Friday the 13th Part 3, he also wrote tie-ins and adaptations for Hawaii Five-0, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, The Partridge Family, a bunch more. In total, he wrote about 24 multimedia tie-ins. But I'm not dead sure why this guy was chosen. He was inducted into the New Jersey Literary Hall of Fame. He lived there for 30 years. Of course, all these movies were made in New Jersey, so maybe it was because he was local. I do have to mention the cover of this one, which features just a drawing of a dude's head wearing a generic, solid white goalie mask, although it does feature the little gash from the axe in the top corner. They're never going to call it a hockey mask in the book. He always refers to it as just a smooth white mask. The big thing here is I do want to give you a few of these chapter titles because these things are amazing. They are deliciously cheesy. We've got Give Him the Axe with an exclamation point. That exclamation point is important. This one might be my favorite. Danger in Black, which of course is a reference to the oh-so-dangerous trio of Ali, Loco, and Fox. And for some reason, all 3 of them are black folks in this book, and the author hits that word really hard. He rarely mentions them by name and constantly refers to them as the black men or the black woman, but the way it comes across, it feels like the black men or the black woman. It's really weird, and naturally, Ali has gold teeth. But back to the titles. We've also got Bloodbath, The Monster is Loose, The Girl and the Ghoul, Horror Unlimited. These things are a goldmine. As for the story itself, there's less to say about this one than I usually have. It's a pretty standard novelization. He makes a few small changes. In this one, Edna finds Harold's body slumped on the shitter with the meat cleaver still in his chest right before Jason kills her. And I do want to point out that this is day 2 of the killing spree that started in part 2, so that timeline thing comes up again. The van is mentioned to be red instead of blue, which bothers me every time I read it. I'm not really sure why. And I always thought that Rick was short for Richard, but according to Michael Avallone, that's actually short for Derek. Who knew? One thing, though, that really throws me off, and it makes me roll my eyes every time I read it, is Jason is going to laugh a lot in this book. The first time it happens is right after Shelley's bad joke when he pretended to be dead. Let me read you this. From the curtained windows of the house, the massive form looked out, seeing them leave. A quiet laugh filled the gloom of the upstairs living room. Later on, he's going to, quote, laugh viciously while Chuck is getting electrocuted on the fuse box. When he kills Chili, it reads, Jason's maniac laughter echoed in the corridor. When he's trying to pull Chris in through the window right before her jacket rips, quote, the massive ghoul chuckled, drawing her upward. It's just, it kills me. I don't know. I can't tell if it's dumb fun or just dumb. There is a fun little moment during Chris and Rick's walk back to the house after Rick's car dies where they come across Abel again. But it doesn't really amount to anything, so if this is something that was filmed and then cut out, I totally understand why. One big change here, though, is the ending and how Chris kills Jason. Instead of just planting the axe in his forehead, she uses it to completely decapitate him. And then we go to Chris in a hospital bed, and this whole ending is weird. It seems like the doctors and the police don't really believe her story, and they think she has just snapped. They even reference her previous attack. So she sneaks out of there to go back to the barn and get answers. She digs around and she starts finding body parts of everyone that Jason killed, but then the barn door opens and Jason is standing there and lops her head off with a machete. Then we cut to a young officer on duty that's watching her in the hospital, and he sees that she's sleeping peacefully in her bed. Just another damn dream sequence. And then it turns out Abel gets arrested and seems to be the prime suspect, mostly because even though this dude's 3 days older than dirt, it took 3 officers to take him into custody, so he's a pretty stout old dude. Honestly, it's just kind of a messy ending. I mean, nobody's listening to Chris, but they don't really tell us why. I mean, I'm okay with some ambiguity, but this just makes no sense. I need some kind of logical flow, and it's just missing here. Overall, and I can't believe I'm saying this, it actually feels like a step down from the previous ones written by Simon Hawke. Of course, those were published later on, but I read those first and did not have as much fun. I still had fun, I want to be clear. Michael Avallone does have a much different style of writing. He pays a lot of attention and gives a lot of detail to the location. He really paints a picture of where the characters are, but he doesn't spend much time in any of the characters' heads. One thing I enjoy in the Simon Hawke adaptations is spending time in Jenny's head or Alice's head or Ned's head and just learning a little bit more about who they are as a person aside from just a number to add to the body count. But that doesn't really happen here. And speaking of Simon Hawke, let's go over to his novelization, which was published in 1988. I haven't really talked about it before, but I'm not sure how they settled on Simon Hawke either. He did write a few adaptations himself, like Predator 2. He wrote a few Star Trek novels, but Simon Hawke was mostly a sci-fi and fantasy author. I'm not really sure why either one of these guys were chosen. I've looked, and I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but I was not able to find much information. Right off the bat, you notice the main difference. Again, Simon Hawke pays a lot more attention to the characters than to the setting. And with his, we start off from Edna's point of view, and we find out that she and Harold were high school sweethearts, and Harold actually had a football scholarship to go to college, and they were going to make it and live their American dream. But then Harold got drafted into the army and sent to West Germany, where he fell in love with dark beer and bad food, and that's where he started getting fat. She doesn't really know when she realized that their dreams were just shot, but she is absolutely the miserable shrew that they show in the movie. And furthermore, she puts every ounce of blame for that on Harold. Harold, of course, is just as miserable and blames every bit of it on Edna. One thing early on in here that did make me laugh is that he says Chuck is 19 years old and Chili is 18. Abso-fucking-lutely not. I know the actors for Chuck and Chili were in their mid-20s, but they looked like they were in their mid-30s. There is not a person on this planet who would buy that they were 18 and 19 years old. But other than that, there aren't any real revelations with the other characters, except for Andy and Debbie. The biggest thing is we find out Andy, he's scared out of his mind, but he's fully on board with being a dad and keeping everybody together as a family. He knows it's going to be hard, but he's not shying away from it. And even though he's always, joking around, this is something he's taken very seriously. We do also get in Jason's head again just a little bit, but it's basically just generic, bland serial killer stuff and the same old shtick that these kids are just like the ones who hurt his mother and he's got to kill them to scratch the itch, the blood fever as he keeps calling it. Now, one thing I was curious about when I sat down to read each of these books is whether or not the writers would give us a clear answer on what happened to Chris. Michael Avallone did not, but Simon Hawke does. After Chris tells Rick about the night she got attacked, and she spells it out exactly the way she did in the movie, Rick has this revelation of why Chris kept pulling away every time he tried to touch her. Quote, like it was her fault that some sick bastard had ... And he thinks, basically, no wonder she acts that way. She was violated, she feels unclean, and she's scared that's how I'm going to see her and that I'll shut her out. So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying it, but yeah, at least in Simon Hawke's vision of the story, Chris was, in fact, raped by Jason. God, that idea just should have been cut. Oh my God, it doesn't belong. But getting back to the characters, he does kind of paint Vera in a more sympathetic light, because even though it doesn't come across in the movie, we get in her head for a little bit, and she actually does like Shelley. She's not sexually attracted to him, she doesn't want to sleep with him, but she does think he's a genuinely good dude and just a sweet guy that she would like to have as a genuine friend. But she's also kind of pissy because all Shelley sees is basically a piece of ass when he looks at her. That's all anybody sees. And so, while Shelley wants her to look past his chubby cheeks and love handles to see more of who he is, he's not looking past her tits and ass to give her the same courtesy. I mean, it's a little cliche, but honestly, she's not wrong, and it does flesh her out a little bit more as a character. Another thing Simon Hawke changes is Debbie's death. It's not a huge change, but instead of the knife coming up through her chest, it does go through her throat, which makes it a complete callback to Kevin Bacon's death in the original. And I do want to point out at this point that we have finally gotten away from the searing white pain when characters die. Another small change I actually like is after Chris hangs Jason from the hayloft, instead of pulling his mask up and giving her that weird grin, the mask just kind of slips up when he's getting the rope up over his head, and Chris sees it and recognizes him. It's a really small change. It's a really small thing, but it's a lot more organic, and it makes a little more sense than how it unfolds in the movie. Outside of those, it's another pretty straightforward retelling of what we see on screen, but it doesn't have the burden of having to point out the 3D effects, which I think helps both books. Overall, I enjoyed the one by Simon Hawke just a little bit more. When I compare the two, it feels like Michael Avallone was trying to make the story genuinely scary and make it more of a real horror story, but my problem there is that it takes itself too seriously. There's just not a lot of fun to be had. Whereas Simon Hawke has a much lighter touch. And it does help, at least for me, I am a little bit biased, that Simon Hawke spends a little more time with the characters. I get a kick out of stuff like that. So do with that information what you will. But at the end of the day, I feel like both books definitely have their moments. I don't regret reading either one of them. Once again, and I'm pretty sure I'll keep saying it, if you can get your hands on them, go ahead and have a good time with them. They're both pretty short. They're about 130 pages or so they're not a big time investment. I don't think you'll feel like you wasted yours, but I definitely wouldn't go out and spend $200 on them. Well, all right, guys. That is going to wrap it up for this episode, but not for Jason. Friday the 13th Part 3 was still a pretty big success, which pretty much guaranteed another one. But at this point, the slasher craze was already beginning to dwindle just a little bit, and the producers were wanting to move on to other projects, And so the decision was made to end the series with Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter, which is where we will pick up next time. Until then, you kids keep your noses clean, understand? We ain't going to stand for no weirdness out here.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Mad and the Macabre. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Join us next episode as we take a look at another piece of the wonderful world of horror. Mad and the Macabre is not affiliated with, and this podcast has not been prepared, approved, or licensed by any entity that created the media analyzed herein. Music is a Horrid Discovery by Ayla Scott, licensed under a Creative Commons license. If you enjoyed the show, support us by leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, and join us over at patreon.com/madandthemacabre for exclusive content. We'll see you next time.